Greetings, CHP listeners all over the world. Laszlo Montgomery here with another China History Podcast episode. Let's get right on it.
Qi has got to be one of the most interesting concepts to come out of Chinese civilization. When you're born, you only have as much qi, as much of this vital force, as your two parents gave you. That was your qi. But you also had li. Li means principle or nature, that essence of who you are. Not physically. This li housed all your natural tendencies and everything about you that was related to your specific human nature. Qi and li. Maybe you could start to fathom what the whole science of qi gong might possibly be all about. Once the idea of qi was understood, well, down through the ages, Chinese masters and even common people from all walks of life controlled aspects of their qi that gave them certain powers, and in some cases, superpowers. 1313 was another banner year in the history of Confucianism. That was the year, more than a century after Zhu Xi's passing, 20 years after the death of Kublai Khan, the fourth Yuan Dynasty Emperor Renzong declared the four books as the core texts for the civil service exams, bringing Confucianism back after a dark period following the Mongol conquest of the Song. Renzong was the first of the Mongol emperors to have a Confucian bent to him. He called for the ideology, as packaged and processed by Zhu Xi, who tied everything together created by the five founders, to be folded into the Mongol government administration of China. This emperor's posthumous temple name couldn't have been more appropriate. Renzong. What Chinese character more than Ren, benevolence, can best represent the thought of Kongzi? That's how it always was at the pinnacle of power, starting around the Six Dynasties period, preceding the Sui and Tang. 1 minute you were up, and then your benefactor, the emperor, died, and the new emperor, or their regent, or dowager empress, favored your rival. Yeah, over the centuries, this state of affairs, all this made for some thrilling factionalism in the royal halls of power in imperial China. And thankfully for the Confucians, this Mongol Yuan Dynasty emperor favored them over the Taoist and Buddhist factions. This made things a little easier come 1368 when the Mongols get swept off the stage of Chinese history, and thanks to this Mongol Emperor Renzong, the Confucians at court were sitting pretty and in place to be a great deal of assistance to Zhu Yuanzhang and his new Ming Dynasty. You may recall a similar state of affairs existed at the dawn of the Han Dynasty in the 3rd century BCE. The Confucianists at court were most helpful in getting Liu Bang comfortable on the emperor's throne. The influence of this philosophy that we call Neo Confucianism, as first crafted by Zhang Zai and his students Cheng Hao and Cheng Yi, and then synthesized by Zhu Xi, spread from China to Japan in the 13th century and to Korea during the Yuan. We remember during the Han Dynasty, Confucianism had already been introduced to Vietnam and had been thriving there ever since. So if you ever find yourself on jeopardy, and the answer is the 12th century Chinese Neo-Confucian philosopher who took the insights made by Zhang Zai and the Cheng brothers to frame his Li Xue philosophy via the cosmological interaction of Li and Qi, you now know to ask, who was Zhu Xi? Later on, Zhu Xi will be criticized for his turning away of new ideas and strongly emphasizing the status quo, and for any thoughts of rocking the boat. By the 14th century, Zhu Xi's version of Confucian thought, known as Dao Xue, or the teaching of the way, or Li Xue, the teaching of principle, became the standard curriculum for the imperial civil service examinations pretty much up until 1905, almost to the end of Chinese imperial history. And for this reason, its longevity and resilience, later historians, statesmen, and writers will look at this as the primary reason for China's conservatism and failure to embrace new learning and new technologies in the 19th century. F.W. Mote said, quote, "The brilliant Song dynasty was in some respects father to the moribund late Qing. However unfairly, Zhu Xi is often blamed for that." End quote. And need I say, Zhu Xi didn't do much to help the cause of sexual equality. This may have been a new kind of Confucianism, but as far as the role of women in society, they remained cemented in this subservient and inferior state. Zhu Xi got blamed for this too. It's not like Zhu Xi came around in the 13th century and Confucianism turned on a dime. Not everyone considered all this new learning that came out of the northern Song to be particularly credible. The orthodox wing of the Confucianists would completely reject Zhu Xi's thought, and later even sent out the call for a back to the Han movement that said, get rid of all these corrupted versions of the classics and their wild commentaries, and let's all get back to the versions of the classics that came from the Han Dynasty. They were the ones closest to the Zhou period where all this thought originated. They knew best. All Zhu Xi and his ilk did was corrupt their meaning. This call to return to the Han was known as Han Xue, as opposed to Dao Xue or Song Xue of Zhu Xi. Even in Zhu Xi's own lifetime, there was an intellectual battle going on between the orthodox Confucianists who were saying, what's wrong with the way it used to be? And these Neo Confucians over the matter of whose interpretation of the ancient texts was the true one. The orthodox Confucians also had a beef with the Neo Confucians because they emphasized only the 4 books, the Si Shu. The orthodox Confucians believed there was a bigger body of work to consider than just the Analects, the Mengzi, the doctrine of the mean, and the great learning. The more traditional Confucians also turned their nose up at the manner in which the Neo-Confucians turned Master Kong into a kind of godhead figure. The traditional conservative type saw Confucius as he saw himself, a humble teacher who had a knack for breathing new life into the long-forgotten wisdom of Yao, Shun, and Yu. I would like to get started with the next big thing in Chinese philosophy. This is in the mid-Ming Dynasty. Emperors Changhua, Hongzhi, Zhengde, and Jiajing. Let's look at Wang Shouren, 1472 to 1529. Perhaps better known as Wang Yangming, for whom Yangmingshan, north of the city of Taipei, was named. There's also a Yangmingshan Sanlin Gongyuan in southern Hunan, Yangmingshan Forest Park, all named for this last philosophical superstar we will look at. Actually, I'll just talk about his background a little, and then, if there's still time left in the clock, we'll get into how he looked at Lu Xiangshan as the one thinker who had the best material to work with, rather than what Cheng Yi and Zhu Xi espoused in their so-called Cheng-Zhu School. Yeah, that's what they ended up calling it, because Wang Yangming had a different way to look at things that jived more with what Lu Xiangshan espoused. And this rival school of Neo-Confucian thought became known as the Lu-Wang School. Lu for Lu Xiangshan and Wang for Wang Yangming. The city of Yuyao gets the honor of claiming Wang Yangming as their native son. He didn't come from wealth or nobility, but his was in every way a respectable family that had produced its fair share of Jinshi degree holders. And one of the interesting fun facts about Wang Yangming is that his father, Wang Hua, when he was a youngin' with aspirations to join the respectable world of officialdom, achieved the highest score in the triennial Jinshi exams. That's like coming out number 1 in China's Gaokao. So with laurels like that resting on his head, Wang Hua picked up the family and off to the big city they went, to the imperial capital of Beijing. Remember, the Ming Dynasty capital used to be in Nanjing, but in 1420 it got moved to Beijing, and that was where all the action was. Shanghai was still 400 years away from being anything worth talking about. And Wang Hua started out working at the prestigious Hanlin Academy, the Hanlin Yuan, founded by no less a person than the great Tang Dynasty Emperor Xuanzong. I don't want you to think of me as a shameless name dropper, but Li Bai, Ouyang Xiu, and Shan Kuo, they all studied there. So if I may dust off the old Harvard metaphor, this was like the Harvard of China, or at least the Rand Corporation. It was a very prestigious institution, and they're still around today. Descendants of both Kongzi and Mengzi were life members, as were those who traced their family ancestry to others we discussed, Zhou Dunyi, the Cheng brothers, and Zhu Xi. So anyway, that's where Wang Hua went to work, and therefore, that's the environment Wang Yangming grew up in. His father was a major rock star in his day, and young Wang Yangming had to live in that shadow. Wang Yangming got to ride on the good old parental coattails and enjoy all that 15th century Beijing had to offer the beautiful people of the day. For a young buck like Wang Yangming, with all that wind blowing into his sails, he thrived, and I'm sure he knew a lot was expected of him. Under such conditions, it wasn't surprising that Wang Yangming became this spectacular child prodigy who, even as a teen, stood out amongst scholars much older than he was who had been prodigies in their day. By the age of 21, he was already saying he had sucked the classics dry for everything he could possibly gain from studying them. So he was going to wander around and learn other things as well, outside of the Confucian solar system. Ironically, with all this pedigree and smarts, it took Wang Yangming 3 tries to pass the Jinshi exam, failing in 1493 and 1496, but he was third time lucky in 1499. He didn't score first, like his dad, but he did place 6th among 297 candidates. But in between his second failed attempt and the third time when he passed, Wang Yangming had retired to his home in Yuyao, Zhejiang province, to reflect on matters, and it was during this time in particular that he immersed himself in Buddhist and Taoist teachings. He learned them and then later rejected everything that he didn't find useful to Confucian thought. When Wang finally began his civil service career, he got off to a flaming start, serving with distinction in public works, criminal prosecution, and the civil service exams. He had acquired a reputation for being a model, morally upright, no-nonsense official. In dark times, however, the morally upright tend not to fare well. When Wang operated in the halls of power, it was the tail end of the Hongzhi Emperor's reign. Yes, the emperor who stayed true to his empress, Xiaocheng-Jing, the famous emperor who had no concubines. But he died, and his son, the Zhengde Emperor, took over. He was famous for a lot of things, not many of them good, but the name that goes hand in hand with Zhengde is the eunuch Liu-Jin. Eunuchs by now in the Ming had a hammerlock on power inside the palace. They had been a menace to the well-being of the Chinese nation during the Han, the Tang, and worse than ever during the Ming. Liu-Jin was the worst of the worst, and unfortunately for Wang Yangming, someone who spoke up for what was right, he fell afoul of Liu-Jin, and in 1506 wound up in prison for words spoken that were critical of this powerful eunuch. He suffered terribly. Physically, he was never what you'd call hardy. Wang managed to survive his stint in prison and saw himself exiled to Guiyang in Guizhou province. Guizhou was a major backwater place, and not for the squeamish. But Wang Yangming made the best of a bad situation and even took a great interest in studying the Miao, ethnic minority people there, and learning what they were all about. He had a lot of time to enjoy some solitude there, always good for thinking about philosophical issues. And it was during this 3-year Guizhou period that the philosopher side of Wang Yangming became more dominant. In the meantime, he continued to learn everything he could about the Miao of Guizhou and probably others in that province. If you're interested in the different ethnic minority groups in China, Guizhou's your place. Yunnan, too. It was only during this period of exile in Guizhou that Wang Shouren transformed into Wang Yangming. In August of 1510, the eunuch Liu-Jin got a well-deserved and long-overdue dose of karma and was given a death sentence. He famously got the death by 1,000 cuts. So with his enemy Liu-Jin out of the way, Wang Yangming and a lot of people who had been on Liu-Jin's bad side all made comebacks. Wang went to Nanjing first, then to the capital, and then got sent to Jiangxi of all places, and it's there where he served brilliantly as a military governor, putting down all manners of ethnic minority unrest directed against the emperor. There was also an uprising directed against the Cheng-Zhu emperor in 1518 that Wang Yangming had a major role in suppressing. That sure gave his career a boost. So you could say this Jiangxi period really caused a major uptick in Wang Yangming's share price. Nothing but good things could come from that. He was once again called back to Beijing, but en route his father Wang Hua died. And you know how it was back then. If you followed Confucianism as your guiding light, if your parent died, you had to drop what you were doing and take 3 years off of your life to mourn them and conduct all the necessary ceremonies and rituals. The dutiful son carried out his obligations, and by 1525, he was ready to jump back into the fray. The venal Cheng-Zhu emperor was gone, and the Jia-Jing era was off and running, another one of the great periods of political backbiting. Wang retired to scholar heaven, the city of Shaoxing in Zhejiang province, next door to the west from where he grew up in Yuyao, part of Ningbo prefecture. Between 1521 and 1527, he began accumulating quite a large following of students and became immensely popular. These students, one in particular, will, throughout Wang Yangming's lifetime and after he passes away, organize, curate, and preserve the entirety of their master's teachings. And this was mid-Ming Dynasty. None of this Zhou, Han, Tang business, where who knows who said what. A lot more content had a chance of surviving from the Ming than those dynasties from the ancient portion of Chinese history. Every great philosopher from Lao Tzu and Confucius all the way up to Zhu Xi, whether or not their torch was carried forward, entirely depended on the enthusiasm and zeal of their disciples. Wang Yangming had such a coterie. Early in the reign of the Jia-Jing emperor, Wang Yangming got sent to Guangxi to deal with some ethnic uprising. I guess whenever the minority people revolted, he was the go-to guy. As he did in Jiangxi and Guizhou, Wang Yangming used rather enlightened and unconventional methods to putting down the disturbances. And once again, he rose to the occasion as a loyal and capable Ming official who was equally adept at military affairs as well. That's why only Wang Yangming can claim to be a philosopher, scholar official, and military general. He went down to Guangxi, and back then it was a tough terrain, and Wang Yangming didn't have the strongest constitution, as you know. So after serving there for a short stretch, he had to depart his post to seek medical attention for his ailments, and en route, he perished. This was in January 1529. So that is the background on Wang Shouren, a.k.a. Wang Yangming. Next time, we'll look at the philosophy of Wang Yangming and how he parted ways with Zhu Xi about one main thing. That's all for the next time we meet.
Once again, thanks everyone for listening. I do appreciate that. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California, politely inviting you to come back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.